BRICS nations meeting the BRICS nations meeting has come to an end after 2 days in Shanghai. The main focus of the meeting was on trade liberalization, and joining us to discuss the effectiveness of this grouping is the Director of Political Economy Southern Africa, that's Sia Biniza. Sia, thanks so much for your time today. We'll talk trade in a moment, but I want to know, in 2017, at this time, how much clout does BRICS still have?
Well, in terms of clout, it depends on what kind of measure you have. So in terms of world population, the BRICS cooperation counts for about 42 to 48% of the world population. So that's very significant. In terms of production or GDP, it's not as influential. However, what they've been able to do is to provide an alternative means to formal capital for governments as well as for development finance, which is a very good step in the right direction given the difficult economic and political environment on the continent, as well as the stringent rules that have been applied by your ordinary financiers such as the IMF and World Bank in the past.
But also what's happened is that they are now at different stages in terms of their economic development. They have different challenges. India is really competing with China in terms of their economic growth and the pace at which they're growing. We know we're pretty much stagnant. Brazil's got some challenges, Russia as well. Are they able to act as a coherent unit?
So this is part of the biggest challenges that they face now, and one of the things to try and resolve this is that they've looked at trade liberalization. So the agenda or the interest in terms of mutually beneficial trading and other economic cooperation has been at the fore of the discussions. However, you know, the challenges with trade or even economic cooperation is that the bigger countries tend to have bigger returns to participation. And so the real challenge would be to how do they mitigate those challenges. So, for example, as you mentioned, South Africa has been growing quite slow, whereas China as well as India, on the other hand, have been right at the forefront, and Russia is still recovering from the oil crisis of 2014. So it all depends on how the negotiations go ahead moving forward, but the strategy will chart a very good way in allowing the discussions to take place.
I imagine, though, there's a bit of tension because was it India that launched 12 trade cases against China earlier this year? Brazil's done the same when it comes to sugar and steel. We've also had some issues raised by our own steel makers. How do they balance those? How do you see them working those tensions out?
Yeah, look, in my personal opinion, I don't think that the BRICS cooperation is going to have a much progress in terms of trade or economic cooperation. I think their biggest benefit or cooperation is around development finance, because particularly that in the current low economic growth environment, the market conditions don't permit for your conventional financiers to lend to African countries and other countries. But what's interesting is that there have now been discussions about seeing which other countries can be part of the BRICS cooperation in order to expand the economic base and then start moving towards much greater trade cooperation. But the challenge is that multilateralism, since the establishment of the World Trade Organization, has pretty much died down, and even challenges within the EU have shown some of the problems around cooperation. So it's primarily been driven by bilateral relations. However, this is a step towards reviving, and obviously the regional integration agenda is very important for South Africa and the African continent, given that there's rising isolationism in the traditional markets such as the US and the EU. So countries are now having to look inward to solve the growth problem.
And that protectionism is a massive issue at the moment. Is the Development Bank, BRICS Development Bank, going to be the foothold then for that multilateralism?
Definitely. I think once the infrastructure is there to connect the markets, because the challenge is that the markets are very far apart. Geographically, in an economic model, there would be no sort of benefit for them to participate, except for maybe the Asian partners. However, the infrastructure gap needs to be filled first to connect the countries, whether it be telecommunications or even transportation, to enable the economic trade to take place. But I think where they've made the biggest strides and progress is around being able to provide financing in economic conditions that don't actually permit for the traditional lenders to be providing financing.
How much of a threat is this protectionism to what you were talking about? When those traditional markets close themselves in, how big a threat is it to the global south?
Well, the traditional markets, the EU and the US, provide ample space for exports to these countries, and this does allow countries to keep growing. However, the unequal benefits to that trading relationship between the global north and the global south has always been one of the primary things that the BRICS cooperation has tried to challenge. But although there is now a challenge of the protectionism and not having access to those traditional markets where we export, the big thing and the big opportunity that exists is looking within. Because the countries on the continent and every other emerging economy are largely closely related in terms of their position on the economic growth trajectory, this allows there to be much greater benefits to cooperation and trade amongst the countries of a lower level of development rather than relying on the traditional developed markets to export goods.